On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Fady Matar. He is the VP of Engineering at Spotter. We're going to be talking about being a super involved engineering leader. Those are his words, and I really thought it was interesting because he has some great views. Fady has some great views on how he can relate to the engineers, how he actually is able to, get in there, drill down, really understand the work, avoid being a bottleneck. We'll ask him about that as well. But super excited to have you on the show. Thanks for being the guest.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you. I'm glad to be on the show.
Thank you, Fady. No, I appreciate it. It's a great topic. I like it. There's obviously different engineering management styles. Some people are very hands off. Some people are super hands on. Being hands on, being hands off, both have their pros and cons. You enjoy being super involved, and I like that. I like that phrase that you mentioned when we spoke earlier about being super involved. I guess before we dive in, just to set context, you're the VP of Engineering at Spotter. How big is your team? How are you guys organized? Just to kind of give some context so that the conversation has a little bit of bearing for people.
Yeah, so the team, when I joined, the team was about 5 or 6 people, and we have been hiring. Like, we already doubled the team, and we have plans to even double the current number that we have. The product we're building is actually pretty exciting. And it requires a lot of bandwidth. It, touches a lot of AI, just like you would expect in those times. A lot of DevOps, amazing interfaces, and of course, an amazing backend that is very scalable to be able to support all of that effort.
Awesome. I guess on your team, just management structure-wise, you're the VP of Engineering. Are you the only manager? Are there other managers you've brought in?
Currently, there is another manager. There's a senior director who was already before I joined. And, we're looking at promoting some people and bringing in more managers because, the team is growing. And at some point, it becomes very inefficient to manage a team above 7 or 8 people. So, that requires constant follow-ups, daily huddles, weekly one-on-ones. So we're bringing in more engineers on board or promoting our current engineers, like, those who are interested in going into a management track, they are given the opportunities to step in and lead.
So when you mentioned being a super involved engineering leader, I thought that was interesting because that's a good approach as well. And I kind of maybe want to set the scene for everyone to understand what that means, because you explained it to me and I was like, hey, this is really interesting. I'm sure other managers are doing this. There's some pros and cons. We're going to dive into all that. But when you mentioned being super involved, what does that mean to you? Or what are you doing to that level when you mentioned super involved?
Yeah, so it's actually setting the standards, the procedures, how we operate, how we communicate, and being super involved in the architecture. Like, I'm the one who signs off on the architecture of anything that we're doing. I contribute a lot to it. Pretty much, I work on every single aspect of the system. And not to mention that, I'm an engineer at heart, and coding has been something that I've been doing since my teenage years. So it's a bit hard to leave that space when there are so many opportunities, so many things to explore, so many frameworks coming out, ideas, a lot of ideas in the open source world, and now with the AI. So for me, it's more of a sense of curiosity, personal satisfaction. And, I want to make sure that we set the right standards. And I think once managers have no idea about the technical complexities that are happening within their teams, that's when things start slipping away. So I make sure that things stay on track. That's the only reason I stay involved. And, I do that not by allocating things or assigning things to the team and then assigning things to myself. I strongly encourage every company, and I've been doing that at Spotter, to take an initiative approach, meaning that you don't like something, that's great. You're free not to like it. Do not complain about it. Give me a better alternative. And this is the example I have set. Like, one of the main components we're dealing with at Spotter when I first joined was not up to my expectations. when I looked at the system and how it worked. So instead of complaining about it, I rewrote it from scratch. Of course, it cost me a weekend of work, but it was totally worth it. Like these are the trade-offs that we'll get to talk about, how you can manage and still be very involved in the code, the architecture, and the morale of the team.
Absolutely. And I mean, you're obviously setting the example. As you mentioned, you're the one who's willing to jump in, take initiative. You obviously, you're obviously still technical, still hands-on. You enjoy coding, and I guess to a degree, I mean, it's talked about. This isn't the first time we talk about it, but taking your best engineers and moving them into management always is an interesting conversation because what they did best is engineering work. Management's a brand new skill they have to pick up. So there's always a component of how do you look at that? Is that a good path? Is it not? In your case, you would love the engineering side of it still. You still like being hands-on. You like to still sit down and code. When it comes to the team, and outside of, let's say in this case, you took on initiative, but outside of that, when you're dealing with the team on a sprint by sprint basis, how involved in the code do you have time to get?
Yeah, lately it's been a bit challenging to get into a lot of critical paths, but for example, I pick one umbrella of projects and I stick to it. This is where I lead. I'm super involved with the code. The rest of the stuff I delegate it to the team. So it's about choosing what is needed at the right time, the right vertical where you can contribute, create an effort, where the team needs your contribution. Because, I'm very involved, but I'm also someone who gets bored really quickly. So what I like to do is I like to set an example, set a standard, resolve the problem, delegate it, and then jump onto a different problem.
I was thinking about it. Obviously, right now, and obviously it's time consuming, right? So I'm thinking about, right now you're at a certain size, and I'm going to ask you two questions. But the first question is, at this size, how much? And I get you pick one of the items in the umbrella. How much time do you devote to staying close to the code? In terms of technical architecture, taking that time to dive deep with the team. Like, how much percentage-wise of your week, or per sprint, do you allocate to that activity?
Well, that depends. Most of the time, it's between 50 to 75% of my time. And especially, Spotter is we're a very small team still, and we have a very exciting and interesting problem that we're solving. So a lot of the complexities that are happening now are mostly on the technical side, not the management side. And, keep in mind, when the team is small, and I'm very lucky to have a team that is very coherent, they get along very well, they communicate with each other really well. So that makes my job on the management side much easier, which allows me, to focus on the technical side, focus on the architecture, focus on the components that are very critical to our operation. And of course, like I would say lately, my biggest bottleneck has been hiring. We've grown the team and we're very particular about the resources we want. We are very particular about, like, for example, I hired recently one front-end engineer, full stack front-end engineer, but it took me around 80 interviews with different people before landing one person. So, this is another effort that takes a lot of my time at the moment, but this is expected. The team is growing, we're expanding, and I want to make sure there is a fit of technical expertise, the right culture, the right attitude, and that's what would make the team very successful.
And obviously, you mentioned you guys are smaller. As you grow, if you were to put on, the fast forward to, let's say 2 years, 4 years out, you've grown, you're getting bigger. Is it sustainable to be able to still take the deep dives? At some point, is there a point in which you're happy? And at the beginning, you said setting the standards, which I think is key, right? You're setting the foundation. Is there a point in which you're like, you know what, I've done that work. The team knows it. It's a part of the culture. I can step back, or is a part of you that is hoping even if you become, a team of 100, you're still going to get, to some level deep with the technology.
Yeah, that's a good question, because in previous jobs, I had bigger teams, much bigger teams. And it was very challenging for me, to stay on top of the code. Like I was involved in the architecture, I was involved with the daily sprints, daily scrums, whatever is happening in there. But it didn't give me a lot of freedom to do a deep dive into the code, even if things are not, the way I optimally want them to be. You have to let go of that. So this is where you have to manage your own, like you have to set the standards right for your own curiosity, that the topics I'm curious about and I want to explore, I'm going to do them when I'm not on the critical path. And most of my time is going to be people management, meetings, product, hiring, the politics within a company, whatever is involved in the management umbrella. I mean, yeah, it's a very good question, because it's a question I try not to think of, because the bigger the team grows, I'll be like, oh no, I want to know what's happening here. Like, are we exploring a new feature? What's happening? I want to do a deep dive. And usually, because, engineering for me it's not a discipline. It's not a job. It's something that I really enjoy doing. So most of the time you find me writing code at 5 a.m. in the morning or after 7 p.m. in the evening.
Interesting. Yeah, I know you've worked for some bigger companies, and I was kind of curious because I know you've seen both sides of it. And, I guess you yourself probably don't want to be the bottleneck. You want to make sure that the team is executing. I guess as you come in and out of this role of having that technical, and right now it's a lot, right? You said 50 to 75%. I mean, it's what the team needs. And I think what I'm hearing is you're watching the team, you're understanding what the team needs, and you're doing what the team needs at this stage, because each stage of evolution will change. How do you make sure you're not the bottleneck? Because obviously it could be it could happen just without even realizing it, that everything comes to your desk without your approval on a small team like this. How do you make sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, so one of the very concerning modules that I recently took over and they implemented, and I mentioned before, like I did that over the weekend. I spent about 4 or 5 days working over a long weekend to get it done. But once I did that, to avoid being the bottleneck, I teamed up with one of my engineers, went through a deep code dive of what I've done, spent a lot of time with that resource to make sure that they understood where I'm coming from, what I'm doing, and then I handed over the project. But I handed over the project in a way that I keep an eye on it, I review the code, I check in with them whenever it's needed, give them suggestions, recommendation. Whenever they have a problem, I jump in to help them solve it, and I let go of it. And that's the point where you have to, draw the line that I've done my part. It's time to trust the team, not micromanage them. And, sometimes it's hard because you see some patterns that you think they could be done better or could be enhanced. But even then, you have to swallow it up, let it go. And there is time where you reconsider that. Like you let it go. And then in the next release, you highlight that point, which means that I think my biggest bottleneck is keeping track of all the things I have to do. That's why I have a dedicated Notion notebook with every single feature of the product where I keep track. I keep, notes of what could be enhanced in the future. And sometimes, the enhancement is really not worth it. So you have to let it slide for a bit and then you tackle it whenever it's ready. But the most important thing is that you're keeping track of what needs to be enhanced and the areas of improvement so you can revisit them or delegate them when needed.
You mentioned, obviously, as the team grows, people will be promoted into management roles. You might bring in managers. In the case of the team growing, you will need managers. And I've heard you mention the foundation, getting it set right, establishing the right standards. I'm sure you're tracking metrics. As you start hiring these managers and they start taking some of what you do, And the hope is always that the standards you put in place are being maintained. It's much like a child. I hope the standards I'm putting into my child will be maintained once she is a full-fledged adult and she's making decisions on her own. I'll see how good a job I did. I don't know yet. We're not there, but very much like a team, you're building those standards. Small team, you're hands-on. You sense that's what the team needs. You're going to grow. The team will. It's a complex product. The team's going to grow. How do you start making sure? Not maybe making sure is the wrong term, but how do you ensure that those standards are being propagated by the managers and making sure that they're continuing all this foundational work you've done?
Yeah, so that is more about the culture and making sure you do the right hires. First of all, at Spotter and pretty much any other job, I never hired a manager who's hands off. Everyone has to be involved in the code. I think of it as one of my best friends is an architect, and his father, who manages the whole company, is also an architect. While he's the CEO, if any of the architects did anything wrong in the project, he can jump in and fix it. Mm-hmm. And the same thing applies in tech. Like, those managers will need to make sure that, first of all, they understand the code base, they understand the product, they understand why those procedures, why the standards are in place. And if they're challenging them, I'm more than happy to listen, because most of the time, if the challenging assumption is correct and can lead us to a better place, I'm all in about implementing it. So the trick about that is to hire the right personalities, people who are not afraid of digging deep into the code, who are not afraid of making mistakes, of trying something new, and who are still aligned with where we're going. So it's two things. It's the curiosity plus the vision, where we're going. As long as these are clear, people have the freedom to do whatever they want to get to the destination, because we know the destination. We know where we're going. We know, for example, that we need to scale to support, let's say, 100 million users or 1 million users. We know the standards that we need to have amazing interfaces that are simple to use, that are very appealing to the users. We're trying to build products where our customers become raving fans about it. And that is the standard that we set. So over here, the trick is about hiring the right people for the right job to make that vision happen.
I guess as you, and I mean, culture and standards, I like that. I think you see that in, I think you see that a lot. I think maybe an easy analogy, if somebody wants to draw it outside of technology, is restaurants. And a lot of times one restaurant works really well. The chef is there. As soon as he opens a second location, she opens a second location, quality drops because that person can't maintain the standards, the culture, the person being put in place isn't able to maintain it. And I think it's very similar to engineering, because I think engineering is very creative in a sense, because you can cook the code differently. There's different paths, there's different decisions, and if that standard. And I guess as you're kind of looking at this, and you mentioned you have the notion, you're keeping track of, how is the standard being communicated? I know sometimes it's tribal because it's a small team. You don't want to take the time to document. Sometimes you're like, well, I'm going to document it. You have your own notion to keep track of things on your own. But I was curious, how does the standard get described or kind of get promoted to other people?
Yeah, that's I really like this question, because the way I do things is never through meetings. We do not talk about things. Talking is a waste of time. Meetings without a purpose are a waste of time. Talking about an ideal world is a waste of time. So it's by doing. For example, when we started hiring for a lot of roles at Spotter, the first thing I did is I went to our wiki and I set all the possible questions we can ask in an interview, why we're asking them, what we're looking for, how you communicate that. And after you do this, it's always a proactive approach. You document and then you propagate it to the team. You create code and then you give an alternative, a solution. It has always to be proactive, because There were so many meetings at different jobs and different places where we would talk and talk and talk and talk, and nothing comes out of it. And then by the end of the quarter, you realize that you spent 30 hours discussing coding conventions. Like, why? Instead, put one in place, have everyone adopt it. If anyone is challenging it, great. Give me a better approach. Is it better? Let's go with it. At the end of the day, this is an engineering firm. And it's an engineering culture. It's not about biases. It's not about opinions. It's not about preferences. Everything has to be about data. If you have data to prove it, you win. If you don't, keep your opinion to yourself.
I like that. I actually think it's interesting, as you mentioned. There's two things that stand out to me. Obviously, doing is very important. The meetings are not. And you mentioned, early on, take an initiative approach, which I think, as I was hearing you describe, how you structure things, it is interesting because you'd much rather. It seems to me you'd much rather somebody to go off and come back with a solution than sit there, and you mentioned, to kind of discuss the ideal state and how we could get there, versus actually seeing, here's what it would look like. Let's take a look at the basics. And when you're looking at that take an initiative approach, what do you ideally want to see somebody bring back? Obviously, too little is not enough. Too much is and maybe too much time invested. How do you kind of help guide someone to come back with the right amount of initiative shown when they take that approach?
It's very specific to individuals here. Because, when you're trying to make someone take initiative, you have to understand where they're coming from. What is their personal biases, preferences, and why the approach is worth it or not. Like, for example, if we're enhancing a component and somebody wants to enhance it just to have a throughput by 5% more, but it's a different stack and a whole different learning curve and something not familiar for the team, that's not worth it. However, if that revamp caused 40-30% increase in throughput, then it's totally worth it. It's time to dig into it. And then that's where you give them all the liberty to go in, explain their approach, explain, most importantly, how they got there. Why did they do it? What was the motivational force for them to get there? And what are the dependencies and the requirements for it? Sometimes it includes a steep learning curve. And even though the business might disagree with it, because, business is all about getting fast results as much as you can, maximizing profits, where engineering is not about that. Where engineering is about setting the right foundation and then getting to the long-term goal. And that's when you see the results. So there's always a balance of this, which is really tricky at times.
I like that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's a little bit art than science, but I do like the idea of a lot of people testing the hypotheses out, doing versus thinking. I think a lot of that is very useful, especially when it comes to technology. And it's interesting because you mentioned you yourself dive in and take that approach, and there's so much that in technology has changed, will change, that you almost have to be selective. You can't do it all. You can't test it all. You have to be able to understand, evaluate. I guess when you're looking at that, and sometimes somebody might have an idea and they're like, hey, I'm going to go run with this. Do you have to stop them and say, hey, that seems like a great idea, but maybe it's too immature, it's too risky? Like, are there guardrails that you try to put in place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, at Spotter, luckily, we don't have that issue because we are very focused on the product we're building. But I have seen that happen at other places I worked at. And yeah, the standard is where basically I set metrics. For example, let's say you're building a microservice, and that microservice is doing a specific task. And somebody comes to you and say, hey, I don't want to use Python. I use Java or Golang or C# or whatever is out there. As long as they can produce the same effort in the same amount of time, that has at least 40% or 30% more throughput, it's all valid. Otherwise, the whole effort has to be scratched out. And what we try to do is that I try to limit the scope to very rapid experiments. Like, what is the thing we're trying to improve? Is it, for example, the boot time of a local development environment? And this is a problem that I have faced at one of my jobs, where the local environment would take about 15 minutes to be set up. And I knew it could be set up in way less than that. Eventually, after a week, I spent some time and I reduced that from 15 minutes to 10 seconds. And that was, once you have this data, no one can argue with it. But that was a very limited, a very scoped effort that was just about enhancing a local development environment for a specific amount of time. So that's how I like to scope it. And sometimes you take an initiative, and I do it as well. Like, I think maybe an idea could be good. And I realize that at the end of the day, it has way more complexities than I thought of. So you shut it down immediately. It's the approach of experiment, prototype fast, fail very fast, and recover from it even faster.
I like that. I love the approach. And not only in software engineering, but it's even sometimes a challenge to apply it in real life. In reality, it might be the best solution sometimes, because thinking for as long as you want to think doesn't always necessarily yield the best outcome. Anyways, being reckless is not good. Let's caveat that. But also, analysis paralysis is real, and I love your viewpoints. I love your description of being super involved and being hands-on, but still really keeping an eye towards the standards, because you're going to grow. So I think it's an amazing.
Absolutely, yeah. You have to keep an eye on the vision, on the roadmap. Where you're going, where you are now, where do you project it to be, where are you going next? Startups to me, and I always try to assimilate whatever I'm doing with my life. So, for example, the way I see startups function, it's like a jazz band. First of all, everyone has to keep the beat. Everyone has to be organized. Everyone can improvise any way they want. But at the end of the day, the tune has to sound good. So it's like you set the framework, you set the melody, you set the beat, and then what happens in between? A lot of creativity. And that's how I like to operate. That's how I like my team to operate. I'm very much for people who come in, challenge assumptions, say, I have an idea. How about we do this? How about we do that? Let's give it a try. Does it fit within that tune we're playing or not? You decide on it. How do you see it fitting with the overall picture? And, once you explain that perspective to engineer, once you make them see it, once you get them involved in it, they become passionate about what they're doing. Then everyone would keep an eye on this melody to make sure that it's absolutely good and they like it, they're enjoying it. Because that's the biggest trick. People who do not like working on the product they're involved in, who are seeing this as just a job, who do not see the value of the product, are most likely to fail no matter how brilliant they are. And, it happened to me. It happened to me as well. I took once a job in a field I'm absolutely not interested in. I set all the right engineering directions and I failed miserably at it. I had no connection with the product, no interest. So these are mistakes I made, and I try to not make again or make my team do those mistakes again.
Yeah, it's I guess the final question I'll ask, or maybe just point is, I'm an ex-software engineer. I own a recruiting company, and most engineers care most about the product they work. And I think most recruiting people, internal, yes, external, sometimes miss how important that is, because you could literally write code for one product, the other, but if you don't have that passion, this jazz band, as you mentioned, the analogy is brilliant. I loved it. I'm going to steal it from you and use it myself in conversations. So I appreciate it. I think it makes it's exactly what it is, because without that passion, without that vision of wanting to jump in at the right time, without wanting to be in tune with the product, you're just doing the job, and writing code can be sometimes monotonous. It can be repetitive. It can get, a little stale. So you need that, vigor of understanding the product and really wanting to see it bloom and grow and all that. So I think that was a great example, by the way.
Thank you.
Awesome, man. All right, I'm gonna let you go. You gotta go jump into a few things. I'm sure I've really appreciated your time being on and sharing. Before I let you go, two things. If somebody wants to reach out to you to pick your brain on anything you've mentioned, what's a good way of doing that?
I think LinkedIn. LinkedIn would be the best option. I check that more than anything. My personal email, I haven't checked it. Like I have around 8,000 emails in my inbox that I haven't checked in forever. So I think LinkedIn would be the best option.
All right, we'll put that in the show notes so everyone can find you there. And then lastly, if you could ask a future guest to come on who's coming on the show to cover a topic you'd be interested in hearing about, what would you like to hear more about?
I think I would like to hear more about defining product specifications. I have been building products for quite some time, and I have seen very different approaches. Like when it comes to a predefined and existing product, it's slightly easier because you know the framework that you're dealing with. But when you start new products, I would really like the perspective of some product people on that. I have been doing that research myself for a few side projects I'm doing. And I was like, how do I make sure I define this product properly? How do I make sure I define the right specs for the right scope and then scale it from there? Especially for me, because, I'm very meticulous about things. I'm very curious. I start with one niche area and then I see myself expanding exponentially in all different directions. I'm like, whoa, how do I got myself into this mess? So that's the topic I'm super interested in.
Awesome, man. That's a really good one. Thank you for sharing. Again, thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Amir. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. That's the end of the episode. Thank you again. Be back again, different topic, different day. Two things. One, I really want to find somebody on the product side who's done brand new greenfield work and dealt with existing frameworks as well. Define this product specifications, the different approaches, the different frameworks. I think a lot of people, listeners, would like that in the different verticals. I think it's very applicable. So if you know somebody, reach out, let me know. Love to have them on the show. And secondly, if you found the podcast interesting, useful, share it with somebody else, a fellow colleague. That's how the podcast has been growing. So I appreciate every week everyone who does that. Like, subscribe, leave a comment. Tell me how to improve it. What else you'd like to hear. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.